So my talk will largely be devoted to the second part of the subtitle, the implications of high-density paths, followed by thereafter some thoughts on the potential role of historiography in all this, and then touching upon some points about the production of syntheses. Now, if looking back over the first 30 years or so of development-led fieldwork in England, it could be seen as a really great experiment in mass data collection, propelled by a dig everything ethos. And in this regard, it's been amazingly productive, effectively allowing the data sets to build up fairly uncritically, and not particularly, it has to be admitted, with much research orientation. And amongst its most revolutionary outcomes has been appreciation of just how densely settled much of lowland Britain was, at least during the Iron Age and Roman periods. However, now in the face of so much and somewhat the sense of the amassing of the past, there does seem to be a really broad consensus for a need of greater research orientation and prioritization. And synthetic studies are fundamental to this. The key being that the amassed data, at least in a number of areas now, should now be sufficient for a high degree of pattern recognition in terms of synthetic study. Now, this slide is intended to illustrate the world we've lost, and with it, easy narratives. On the right side is an archive version of Cyril Fox's Beaker distribution plan with its really readily discrete regional clusters, like so many characters waiting for their author. The middle maps stand for what we now have, if combined, in terms of Beaker distributions, with most recent updating being Bournemouth's AIP version, which is now a decade or more late. Out of date. And to wit, the lack of period distributional mapping is currently proving to be a really major hindrance to the production of syntheses and research generally. And it's something which really does require urgent address, because far too much time gets wasted on the assembly of basic data sets, and, for example, is now seen as inhibiting student dissertation work on archaeological themes. You know, this idea that you've got to assemble the maps because somehow it's good for students. And even on the major synthetic projects, if you ask Mike Fulford or Chris Gosden, they'll say that basically a quarter to a third of their time and their budgets is being spent on assembling data sets. And if we could get over that somehow, production of syntheses would be a lot cheaper. Now, as to the left side of this, wrong way. Okay. The top map on the left there is the work of two Cambridge students published in 1973 concerning the Iron Age in Cambridge. And with the incredible audacity of only young Cambridge students can have, they've announced that on the finding of this site down at Trumpington, then the 9th known in the Cambridge area, they concluded that it's reasonable to presume that all or almost all of all the sites of the period are now being known within the area, and they have a spacing of 1 to 1.5 miles between them. Now, it's really useful and rare to have such explicit period density statements from earlier researchers. Little were they to know just how far out their assessment was. The scale of the development work that has been in the city margins, the lower left there, the red areas, has demonstrated that upwards of 100 Iron Age settlements would actually fall within the same area. And indeed, on the area that's circled on the maps, within the immediate area of Addenbrooke's hospital environs on the south side of Cambridge, there are more than 9 sites of Iron Age date in that immediate area. Those are the gray blobs shown here. Okay. Oh. You have some problem, Houston. Okay. Why? This is Stuart's introductory one. It just crashed, but this means I have to go through 4 session slides. Stuart, why don't you go through 4 sessions? So crashing aside, The whole theme of high-density paths has been something we've been hammering away on for quite some time. And last year, the Cambridge Archaeological Unit produced 2 papers on this theme involving partner organizations in that case, and also a number of colleagues, with the funding provided in this case by Historic England. And we'll start with the one. We're still getting there. Any moment now. We'll start with the one that appeared in the Archaeological Journal last year, which is on the theme of abundant landscapes, and include 4 tiered levels of case study, leading with the Cambridge case study, which I'll come back to in a minute, but also included Albion. Oh, wait a minute.
Getting close?
Well, now you've gone right through mine.
Right.
Well, we can say it's done.
Getting there? But yeah, wonderful.
So there we are. Much like unsynthesized archaeology itself. So in including case studies by Albion Archaeology on Bidlam Loop and Marsh Lees area. Now in this work, we're strictly focusing on the Iron Age and Roman densities, because in a sense, those sites are readily identifiable. They don't have the ambiguity, for example, early Bronze Age settlement. So it included that. It also included studies provided by the Oxford Archaeology, the Upper Thames area. And aside from 2 geophysical programs in East Kent and East Yorkshire, included Chadwick and Green's Roman summary of their Roman characterization and predictive modeling, roll cap, down in the bottom right here. Now, these demonstrate abundant local values. For example, the Thames study is showing 2.3 Iron Age settlements per square kilometer and 1.9 Roman, with Bedford showing 0.6 and 1.2 sites per square kilometer, respectively. What you do find in all this kind of work is that consistently the Roman sites, let's face it, Roman occupation in Britain is much shorter than the Iron Age, and at the same token, the sites are much larger, so that basically the Roman densities are lower. Now, based on this, the gist of that paper is that in certain areas of the country, particularly lowland England, we do seem to have achieved something that could be referred to as knowledge plateaus. And as a result, we need to start moving beyond the curation of settlement dots to, actively understanding settlement networks and their organization. Now, turning to Fox's 1923 Cambridge region study, The Archaeology of the Cambridge Region, which remains a really useful book. And it's a comprehensive overview of its time. And it provides a gauge of settlement densities and their landscape interpretation. And this becomes interesting in thinking whether we should be updating, when we produce synthesis, should we be updating them regularly? Because something like this, they do become documents of their time. And what the basis that you thought this then because you had this mount. And if we always see our syntheses as being updated, we lose that temporal dimension, which I think is really valuable. Now, in the volume, he characterizes. You seem to be having trouble with this. We're having trouble again. Great. Well, it's going to be your turn again. Briefly saw, and that was his Bronze Age map, and that you had a big swathe of white coming down one side and green elsewhere. And what it was based on is his characterization of landscape, which he saw the open lands, the well-drained, primarily the chalk, versus the green, which he termed cold claylands, which Fox basically didn't think was utilized until well into the Roman period. Now, what I'm actually showing on that plan is the distribution plan of the Bronze Age. And what's interesting in that case is you've got this massive dots, they're all barrows sitting up on the chalk downland, but he's only got 4 settlement sites listed at the time. And that's really quite interesting because the basis of it is that it's clear if you look at the early authors, they knew they didn't have everything. they're not dealing with total data sets, but they clearly didn't think they were far off at the time. And one of the results of this, there we go. We've got, pardon? That's exactly it. Well, is that exactly it? Well, that'll do. Anyways, that's it. So you've got 4 settlement dots on the map. All the rest is barrows and various hand axes, etc. And that's interesting, is how do they see the past operating? And one of the things is the whole thing about mobility that became a sort of leitmotif of early British archaeology, to explain why, when settlements were so far flung from each other, how could they share the same material culture? And as a result, you had to have things like wandering blacksmiths, migrant potters, etc. And transhumance became the great linking theme in terms of how sites had these kind of connections, very much mobile based. And this sort of approach of low density paths really kept on until the 1970s. It underpins Hoskins' work, this whole emphasis that all the prime spots in the landscape were taken by modern villages, or today's extant villages, that's where you're going to be. And so, and it also fueled the rescue movement of the 70s, the idea that there was very little past. And it was really Chris Taylor, in a series of works in the late 70s and early 80s, who started dealing with the question of total archaeology and the impact of both aerial photography and also early motorway work that started changing this. Now, on the right side here, the top shows basically Fox's, the number of Iron Age and Roman sites that he plotted, and below, based on various data sets which are in the antiquity paper that we produced as of 2015. And it shows obviously an extraordinary increase, 21-fold increase of Iron Age settlements and a 7-fold increase of Romano-British. And do you still, why don't you do it?
Is that the next one?
That's the next one. Now, in addition, what we've also done is then to compare the recovery from 6 major huge-scale projects that recently occurred in the region, in the Cambridge region immediately to the north, and largely the area across the Clay Plain. 2 of these relate to road development, the A14 and the A428, and 4 relate to housing, Camborne, Love's Farm, North Stowe, and Greater Northwest Cambridge. Okay, the next slide, please. Now, as shown on the top left here, of these, the average value of Iron Age settlement is 2.5 per square kilometer, whereas again lower for the Roman it's 1.4. Yet they also show considerable variability. And one of the things you do see when you do this kind of work is that the motorway and infrastructure projects consistently come out lower in their densities. They're not very good for actually working out average densities because the problems of linear transects. And that's a classic standard sampling problem they were quite aware of, for example, in the days of new archaeology. Now, the highest Iron Age value comes from Love's Farm, which has a staggering 8 sites per square kilometer, almost twice the density of any others. And that's probably largely attributed to its riverside situation. The highest Roman is the Greater Northwest Cambridge project at 4.3 settlements per square kilometer. And it's shown both here and on the upper right here, but also in the bottom left, you get the circle. But it's also quite interesting. That's the Roman rural projects, Fenage case study. But also notice the other clustering. For example, very marked in that case, the red dots here being Camborne. So that, this is quite important. We'll come back to arguments about the levels and integration of syntheses, where we see them interacting, and how you recognize areas of high density. Okay. Now, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and the table that's down in the bottom right here, we plotted the 6 project densities against a number of other large-scale projects in lowland Britain, and then went on to compare them to the Western Roman provinces on the continent. That's what the right-hand side of this is. And it is extraordinary, and you can actually see that there's only one instance in southern France where the Roman densities are higher than you're getting in Britain. So we are very clear indication that we are seeing very, very abundant land use in this case, and that a lot of the settlements are only 200 to 400 meters apart through large areas. This is the whole point, that they can wave to their neighbors. You don't need transient potters. You don't need wandering blacksmiths. The issues of information transmission under these circumstances become paramount. But the whole sort of mobility need is really taking a challenge. And really, what the other thing we need to start focusing on, and it's not saying all these sites, the Roman sites in this case, are directly contemporary, but they are in the 2nd century. And it's how sustainable these kind of intense land use systems are. How do they environmentally carry these kind of densities that were going on? Now, I would argue that the results amount to something according to should be like a new paradigm shift and game changing, effectively another loss of innocence in David Clarke's terms. But it's something that really requires much further acknowledgement, I think, in terms of our archaeology, because the rules of the game have changed really quite dramatically in the recognition of these kind of densities. The next slide, please. So in 2002, we held a workshop on the theme of synthesis in the Society of Antiquaries, and with also online participation. And we've all seen these volumes now a number of times. The main work's under review, and very much authors looking back in terms of the production of synthesis, what they feel worked, what didn't work. Now, amongst the most insightful comments on the day were those of Simon Schaefer, the historian of science, and was saying, because as archaeology begins to contend with the problems of big data, and saying, well, there's nothing new in this. The science has been dealing with this situation since the 1970s, and everybody says it's exactly the same thing. You never get the database right. You're putting all this effort into grooming and cleaning the database. It's invariably going to be faulty, at least based on their experience. And that, I think, is really quite insightful, because really, the issues you hear about the compatibility of HER data are really something of a leitmotif in terms of the production of syntheses. Next slide, please, Stuart. Now, amongst the most interesting of these synthetic studies has been Oxford and Gosden's English Landscapes and Identities program, and very much a big data project. I think something like 900,000 records they had to work through. One of the things that's interesting, is in terms of the issue of what is a region of study, which itself is not, we deal with it quite a bit in the various papers that we've issued. It's not self-apparent. And in this case, they were trying to test it. And you can see that the way that there's main study transects cross-cut set regions. But still, at the end of the day, it is quite a it's not a million miles away from Cyril Fox's personality of Britain interpretation, the sense of the highland-lowland divide. It still becomes the abiding motif in many ways at a national level of British archaeology. Next slide, please. Now, appearing at the same time as we had that, in The Guardian, literally the Saturday before, appeared this article in relationship to science's big data studies. It is important to realize this sense of how do we feel we're going to progress with this work? Is it the death of theory? Do we think big numbers just talk for themselves? What is the inductive role in theory in all this? We don't have an answer, but it remains a major issue. Also ready to hear are questions of site-type categorization that has been applied to these, to the interrogation of these sites and basically accepted at face value. Next slide, please. And just to point out, I think in this regard, I think an awareness of the historiography of the subject is quite important. The unit's produced 2 books on this theme, 2 studies. We've got another in the work in terms of George St. Gray at Ham Hill, because it's really important, the sense of where that we don't just accept site categorization at face value. We need to know where the concepts that lie behind them and the interpretation that's been employed to them. And this whole sense that, we're now digging after origins. We shouldn't really be any longer see as a subject just directed toward the discovery agenda, but the sense of that in any instance, we work and dig as much as been written before as what is in the ground immediately before us. Okay, next, just quickly move on. Amongst the 21 CAP various other commission studies, one of the ones is issues of standardization in terms of site analyses to allow comparison of results. Just to point out, top left, this is the kind of density tables we've regularly been producing for our Roman sites per hect of densities. Down below, we've started playing with volumetric sampling, which really does take quite a while to get your head around. But it's clear that certain types of, if we're going to have comparison against our data sets, some degree of standardization of expression does need to come in. Because you can't have it said by one group that, they've retrieved 2,000 sherds off of an Iron Age site, and that's really a lot. And then, an organization on the site besides saying, we got 2,000 sherds from the site, and it's actually very little, because it's all ultimately based on how much you dig and how do you dig, whether you're sieving or not, et cetera. So that's a fundamental question. Next slide, please. Just so we don't have to point out, one of the things we do seem at the unit we were committed to is we should not allow methodologies at the same time to become straitjacketed. And it is essential that we allow and keep a good degree of innovation and arguably experimentation. The left-hand side image just shows experiments in terms of volumetric sampling. What does a cubic meter of soil look like? What happens if you introduce 100 sherds, 200 sherds, 300 sherds? And really interesting that you only see it as a midden-type deposit when you start getting up at the level of 300 or 400 sherds per cubic meter. So it's quite high. Next slide, please. Finally, what is the direction of synthetic travel and whether it's envisaged as a bottom-up or top-down process? And do they dovetail? It's crucial that we acknowledge their differences. The national level, generally being very expensive. You're not getting a lot of change out of £1 million for a national synthetic study, and require major academic grants, and have largely been university-based and period-directed, and accordingly very broad-brushed in their approach generally, and mainly reliant on assessment-grade literature. Now, as you proceed down the chain from regional to sub-regional, the key question is whether grade literature remains sufficient, and if more detailed reportage and publication analyses will be required to do justice to them. Now, at a regional level, always begging the question of what defines and constitutes a region, unless informed by national level studies, in some areas, such as Cambridgeshire North, it does seem that we're now approaching something in the range of having, or shortly will have, dug 10% of the predictive total number of sites, at least of Iron Age and Roman sites. And this certainly seems an appropriate threshold for which now needs screamingly overview. What are we going to say? That we can only do proper analysis when we get 20, 30% of the sites dug? 10% is a reasonable sample by any criteria. Last slide, please. Now, of course, all levels of synthetic study are required as each inform upon each other. Remember how much the Greater Northwest Cambridge and also the Camborne clusters stand out on the Roman rural project's FenEdge case study, basically in itself being sub-regional. But you recognize the pattern, the local pattern, speaks largely in terms of the upper level of the chain, whether it's regional or even a higher sub-regional level. Realistically, though, sub-regional syntheses will probably be the most likely to be advanced, as it is something that falls within the financial range of some large-scale landscape programs, especially those rising out of infrastructure and, or in this case, as shown here at Northwest Cambridge. They have the virtue of potentially identifying settlement networks, which is becoming clearly a theme you hear talked about. It's talked about a great deal in the A14 day. That if we begin to see that we can see the networking, what level do we see networking? And of course, they're happening at various levels at a time. But it does seem the local, the sub-regional, is probably a very appropriate place to start addressing, in this case, trade and exchange, and through greater use of aDNA analysis, intermarriage patterning. Only two of the sites so far on this have had the cemeteries done, and there's 2 more we would hope to get done. Now, based on this, they can then appropriately inform both regional and national synthetic studies, as they certainly have a greater potential to interrogate the social dimension, whereas national level study is inherently likely to more be determined by geographic factors, not necessarily so, but likely being so. So with that, I'll leave it there. There seems to be much to discuss. Thank you.